I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Volodymyr Zelensky tells Russia the war is coming home as Ukrainian troops make fresh advances as part of a week-long invasion of the Kursk region. We bring you the latest news from the front and look deeper into the man Putin has appointed to lead the defence of Kursk, Alexei Dyumin. We also round up the latest political and diplomatic news and explain why a quiet archipelago off the coast of Finland is on alert for Russian spies.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Cleave stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 13th of August, 2 years and 76 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, foreign breaking news reporter Iona Cleave, Berlin correspondent James Rothwell, and senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David, hi team. So the news today is driven by Ukrainian forces reportedly launching new incursions into western Kursk Oblast. So let's do just a quick little bit of geography once again, because we're going to be throwing a lot of towns and cities at you. So we're in the northeast northeast region of Ukraine. You've got the Ukrainian city of Sumy. This is about 200 kilometers east of Cleave, about 150 k's northwest of Kharkiv. Sumy is about 30 kilometres from the border with Russia, which in this area is a line roughly running northwest to southeast. Now, just over the border, about 5 k's further into Russia, is the town of Sudza. That's now thought to be evacuated and under total Ukrainian control. Now, Sudza seems to be the base of this Ukrainian lodgement in Russia, which sort of spreads out from there northwest, northeast, and southeast for about 20 k's in each of those directions, a big sort of circular blob or big lozenge there, except for the south, where further border crossings earlier this week by Ukrainian troops into Belgorod Oblast, that's the one to the south, have extended the area held by Ukraine. Now let's go back to the border. That line, like I said, was very roughly running northwest-southeast. Not quite exactly northwest-southeast. There's a big rectangular chunk digging into Ukraine that starts just west of Sudza. It runs roughly west for 20 k's, then northwest for 20 k's, north for 40 kilometres, and then back east for 20 kilometres, and then carries on in the northwesterly direction. So a roughly rectangular chunk. Last week, I suggested Ukraine might be trying to grab the land in that triangle for all the reasons we've been discussing over the last few days, to negotiate the trade of land, morale, force Russia to divert equipment from the Donbass, show Putin's weakness, all that kind of thing. I also suggested that land in that rectangle, if Ukraine were able to take it, could be more easily defended, because they'd be working on interior lines of resupply, and their flanks would be protected because it's Ukraine to the left and the right. So that's what I was suggesting last week. Well, today there have been new Ukrainian incursions reported across the border into areas in this rectangle that's not previously held by Ukraine. So we'll go first of all to the town of Slobodnya Ivanovka. That's about 50 k's northwest of Sumy city, about 2 kilometres over the international border. Then you've got the town of Tetkino, about 20 k's south of there. And then you've got Gordivka, further along the border, about 20 kilometres to the west of Sudza. So those three towns, not previously held by Ukraine, are all in that sort of rectangle bit that I've just tried to describe. You know, I'm not going to speculate on, is this the push to fill in that lodgement, but I just note it for the geography. Now, reports that the main Ukrainian incursion, that the lozenge, if you like, based on Sudza, have gone static, seem to be incorrect. Fighting has been reported around the town of Koronovo, that's 30 kilometres northwest of Sudza. Ukrainian forces are said to have been trying to bypass that town rather than get bogged down fighting through it. And then geolocated footage from the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, shows Ukrainian forces advancing within Kremyanoye and to the east of Zur Valley. They're both about 5 kilometres east of Koronovo. Additional geolocated footage shows Ukrainian forces advancing in the forest area to the north and the east of Semenovka. That's about 20 kilometres east of Koronovo, 30 km north of Sudza, during what the ISW assessed to be a likely battalion-sized mechanised assault in the vicinity of a town called Karchuk. If so, I would suggest that's probably flank protection of any main advance in the village of Karchuk, as there's a main highway running north to south a little further east. Geolocated footage also shows Russian forces having ambushed Ukrainian troops in central Giri, that's 20 km southeast of Sudza, indicating Ukrainian forces at least temporarily advanced that far, although it's not clear if Ukraine maintained their positions, were forced out, moved around or what have you. Russia's defence ministry said its air defence had destroyed 12 Ukrainian drones over Kursk, one over Belgorod and one over Voronezh, that's an oblast a little bit further to the east. And Russian officials in Kursk and Belgorod put out warnings of missile attacks. Now, likely connected to the events further to the northwest into this sort of Kursk incursion, whatever we're going to call it, the local Ukrainian governor of Kharkiv region said yesterday that Russian forces have reduced the number of guided bomb attacks on border settlements in the area there. Speaking on national TV, Oleh Sibinov, the governor, said, "We've been recording a sharp decrease in guided bomb strikes in recent days. If our border area has seen from 30 to 60 guided bomb strikes a day, now it's no more than 10. Just finally, I can't verify any of this, so I'll leave it till last, and it does seem a little bit odd, but there's footage on social media you'll be able to find of a Ukrainian soldier that's filmed himself on the outskirts of Lvov, that's 50 km north of Sudza, on the main east-west road that runs, when it comes out of Ukraine, runs due east into Kursk city itself. It was on that road a little bit further to the west last week. There was that strike on a number of Russian troops, or troop transporters carrying soldiers. So Kursk is about 50 km to the east of this city of Lvov. The individual in the film said, "I hope Mama doesn't see this video. I promised Mama I wouldn't go far away." You can see the road sign in the background. Only went up earlier on today, so we haven't had a chance to verify any of that. But it could, if they're up in Lvov, that is quite an extent. Now, a separate video shared by a popular Russian war blogger purported to show the capture of guards from the prison in Lvov. Penal colonies on the northern side of the city suggests its guards must have been used in some sort of military action if they were taken prisoner of war, possibly trying to stop Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of the city. Long traffic queues are known to have been seen, last week around Lvov as the residents tried to get out of the way. And as I say, we can't verify any of that. That does seem to be a bit of an outlier. And the whole thing about the Russian war blogger putting it up, I find a bit odd. But as we've said before, very unclear about exactly what's where, as you'd expect, and we're trying to piece it all together. But health warnings to all these sort of locations and directions and dispositions. But that's a sort of tactical update, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for that. Can you go on and tell us a little bit about what we've heard from Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, so a bit more. Zelensky in particular, and Ukrainians specifically, have been very tight-lipped about this. But President Zelensky said last night, Russia brought war to others and now it's coming home. Ukraine has always wanted peace and we will undoubtedly ensure peace. He said he'd ordered the preparation of a humanitarian plan for the area. Now, also yesterday, Putin vowed to drive out the enemy and accused the West of fighting us with the hands of Ukrainians. These were his first public remarks on the operation in Kursk. They took place during a very terse Security Council meeting in Moscow. Putin said the task before the Ministry of Defence, so we're going to talk about who's doing what, the command and control in a minute, but it's interesting to note who's supposedly responsible for which bits. Putin said the task before the Ministry of Defence is to squeeze out, drive the enemy out of our territories and, together with the border service, ensure reliable coverage of the state borders. The enemy will certainly receive a worthy response and all the goals facing us will, without a doubt, be achieved, obviously, because all those goals are always achieved. I added that last bit. He carried on, "It is clear now why the Kyiv regime rejected our proposals to return to a peace plan, as well as the proposals of interested and neutral mediators. Apparently, the enemy is striving to improve its negotiating positions in the future. But what kind of negotiations? How do we even talk with people who indiscriminately strike at civilians, at civilian infrastructure, and try to create threats to nuclear energy? What can we even talk about with them?" Now, take your tongue firmly out of your cheek. David, I know he's talking absolute hogwash there about how bad it is to strike at civilians and all the rest of it. I thought it was interesting how much he was talking about negotiations. I know he's saying, oh, we now can't have a peace plan or anything, but the mere fact he's talking about it, I think is interesting because it is unusual. Now, at that meeting, Kursk Oblast acting governor Alexei Smirnov said that 180,000 people were now being evacuated from areas that border Ukraine. He also said that Ukrainian soldiers controlled 28 villages and towns. When he mentioned that last bit, he was very quickly shut down by Putin, who snapped at him to stop talking about military matters and stick to the civilian assistance being provided. So if Mr. Smirnov had wandered off message, perhaps wandering towards an open upper floor window as we speak, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service is resolutely staying on message. So the SVR was cited by Russia's RIA state news agency yesterday, said President Zelensky is taking insane steps that threaten escalation far beyond Ukraine. Similarly, Russia's state news agency TASS said yesterday 11,000 people had been evacuated from regions near Ukraine, areas that are currently out of the fighting. Russian MOD said over the weekend it was sending conscripts and mercenaries into the Kursk region, but changed that tone yesterday to say it had ordered a comprehensive force to be built up for combat operations. Now, the command and control of all this looks very confused. There's army, there's FSB, there's border guards, Rosvardia, etc., etc. I just remember the remarks by General Mark Carleton-Smith, former head of the British Army. They said the very first thing you have to do, and you have to spend time on it and get it right, is work out the command and control. Basically, who can tell who to do what. If you don't get that sorted straight away, you are left with an absolute bugger's muddle. So let's see what happens here. Now, Joe Barnes reporting today says that Putin has appointed one of his former bodyguards to lead the effort to end the invasion. I know Roland is going to be talking more about that later, so I won't say any more. Other commentary, Nigel Gould-Davis, who's a senior fellow at the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, one of the sort of global think tank, defence security think tank here based in London. He said the Kremlin's response to the Kursk incursion had been confused and improvised. He said this is a mini occupation. Ukrainian soldiers have spent a week there. They've taken control of the Sudza gas transit station. They are eating and sleeping and waking up in the morning on Russian territory. Then in a video published on President Zelensky's social media site, General Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, said, "We continue to conduct offensive operations in the Kursk region. As of now, about 1,000 square kilometres of the territory of the Russian Federation are under our control." Separately, President Zelensky has put pressure on Britain to allow missile strikes deep inside Russia, as he's saying that this attack could, in the right circumstances, lead to the downfall of Putin. Again, Joe Barnes reporting this. Now, however, Telegraph understands that the British government has not given Ukraine approval to use Storm Shadow missiles as part of the Kursk offensive. A government source speaking to Telegraph said there has been no change. You may remember during a visit to Britain last month, President Zelensky lobbied Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister here, to lift restrictions on how Storm Shadow could be used. Cleave has also asked Washington for permission to use ATACMS long-range missiles during the Kursk offensive, but that request also seems to have been refused. And then just before we move away from Kursk, David, I note that in the last hour, Georgy Tykhy, Ukraine's foreign ministry spokesperson, speaking at a press conference just in the last hour, said that the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast would be less necessary if Kyiv were allowed to fully utilise its long-range capabilities against Russia. This comes from the Kyiv Independent. They had a reporter in the room at the press conference, reported the foreign ministry spokesperson as saying, if Ukraine could strike the enemy troops on their territory from where they threaten Ukraine, then Ukraine would be in a much better position to protect itself. In particular, it would be less necessary to use the Ukrainian defence forces outside of the Ukrainian borders, including Kursk Oblast. All fears must be left behind, and we must be allowed to fully utilise our long-range capabilities to reduce Russia's military potential. That's the updates from Kursk region, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Let's zoom out of Kursk and look across the rest of the battlefront. What can you tell us about news from Ukraine?
Yeah, so more widely, Russian forces seem to have stepped up their attacks on the Pokrovsk front in eastern Ukraine over the last day. This comes from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. They're reporting the largest number of battles in the area in a single day for a week. Russian forces have been trying to push towards the logistics hub of Pokrovsk for months. We've been talking about it. They have been inching forward incrementally, taking advantage of greater troop numbers, pounding the place with glide bombs and then sending forward the meat assaults to stick a flag on the rubble, basically. Elsewhere, continued grinding Russian advances in the Donbass are going on, although Ukrainian counterattacks have regained some ground south of Touretsk and New York that we've been talking about recently. But on that front, very, very limited, little movement from both sides. Now, Russia launched 38 attack drones and 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles at Ukraine overnight, according to Ukraine's Air Force speaking this morning. They say 30 of the 38 drones were destroyed over 8 Ukrainian regions. Not clear what happened to the other drones and the missiles, but Sumy regional authorities reported injuries and said that attacks had damaged a power line and gas pipeline, cutting supplies of both for a time. And just finally, looking at today's British Defence Intelligence update here, they say Russian military units are facing drinking water shortages in Ukraine due to Russia's own strikes against critical infrastructure. They're citing a report from a pro-Russian military blogger, which highlighted how Russian pilots had been restricted to 1 litre of water a day, which they say is a quarter of the minimum required. The MOD says as a result, Russian servicemen have been forced to approach local citizens for water, improvise filtration systems, or use stagnant puddles, which has highly likely, in their words, led to an increase of waterborne diseases among Russian soldiers. The MOD added, water supply issues faced by Russian pilots will have been exacerbated by record-breaking temperatures in Ukraine at the moment. And I'll take a little pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls, for all of those updates. Hugely indebted. Iona, Cleave from our foreign desk. Can I come to you next? You've been looking at some of the political and diplomatic news that we should be paying attention to. Would you start just by relaying to us some of the American reaction to what we're seeing in Kursk?
Yes, thanks, David. The White House on Monday has commented but not directly commented on the ongoing incursion in Kursk. John Kirby, the White House's national security spokesman, told Vladimir Putin that he should end the war in Ukraine if he doesn't want to be invaded. Those comments came on Monday night. He said he wouldn't comment on the ongoing military operation, which Ukraine continues to remain tight-lipped about, and instead said, make no mistake about it, this is Putin's war against Russia, and if he doesn't like it, if it's making him a little uncomfortable, then there's an easy solution. He can just get the hell out of Ukraine and call it a day. Also on American reactions, US Republican Senator Lindsey Graham called Ukraine's surprise cross-border operation in Russia's Kursk region bold and beautiful during a visit to Cleave. He said, so 2.5 years later, you're still standing and you're in Russia. Remind me not to invade Ukraine. I'm so proud of you, your people, your military, your leadership, your country, he said to Zelensky, adding that the move was bold, brilliant and beautiful. And then the US also warned Iran yesterday against sending ballistic missiles to Russia, saying it would invoke a severe response and would counter efforts by Tehran to improve relations. The US has been in touch with its European allies and reports that Iran is planning to deliver hundreds of ballistic missiles to Russia, a State Department spokesman said. They continued by saying, we are prepared to deliver a swift and severe response if Iran were to move forward with the transfer of ballistic missiles, which in our view would represent a dramatic escalation in Iran's support for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It also comes as Iran has been showcasing one of its newest long-range attack drones, known as the Mahajir-10. Western officials have accused Iran of sending drones to Russia, including the Mahajir-10's predecessor, the Mahajir-6, to be used against Ukraine. Iran first released details of the Mahajir-10 system in August last year. According to Iranian media reports, actually, that the drone has an operational range of 2,000 kilometers, can fly for 24 hours and carry a payload of 300 kilograms, which is double the capacity of its predecessor. So it was showing all that off at a Russian military fair on Monday. And keeping on the topic of Iran and the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, I'd just like to quickly mention that last night Keir Starmer directly urged Iran not to attack Israel in a rare phone call with Tehran's president. Sir Keir told Masoud Pezeshkian that there was a serious risk of miscalculation and urged Iran to refrain from attacking Israel. He's the first PM to have a call with any Iranian leader in 3 years, and it comes at a time of soaring tensions across the Middle East, as Israel continues to brace for an expected attack from Iran and its regional proxies in the wake of the killing of Hamas's political leader and a senior commander in Lebanon's Hezbollah. The US and Israel both expecting an attack to come this week, while Iranian drone and missile units are being prepared, according to reports. There was a serious risk of miscalculation, and now was the time for calm and careful consideration, Number 10 reporter Starmer is saying. And just quickly, returning to Ukraine, I'd love to highlight a great story our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes did. He took a detailed look at how Ukraine's Kursk invasion is starting to become known as Operation Triangle, after he geolocated images and videos of Ukraine's tanks, trucks and NATO military equipment emblazoned with white triangles as they marauded around the Russian countryside. Ukrainian sources say the tactical marking is no more than a way for Kyiv's forces to avoid friendly fire as they operate behind enemy lines in their fast-paced, week-long mission. However, it appears to be an answer to Russia's Z symbol, a marking that first appeared in white paint on Russian combat vehicles and tanks at the very start of the invasion in February 2022, and now has become synonymous with support for Putin's war.
Thank you very much, Iona. And just for all of our listeners, we'll put those articles in the show notes so you can read them in your own time. And of course, Iona's been running the Telegraph's live blog on the war in Ukraine. So do follow that for the latest updates. Thank you so much, Iona. I know you have to get back to the desk, but thank you so much for joining us. James Rothwell, let's come to you next, our Berlin correspondent. But you haven't been in Berlin, James. You've been up in islands in the Gulf of Finland. Where did you go, James, and why?
Hi everyone, yes, I've been in the Roland Islands, an autonomous territory of Finland, which is at the centre of a NATO debate really about whether it's time for these islands to be remilitarised. I'll just set the scene for you a little bit. We're talking about a cluster of islands in the middle of the Baltic Sea, which have been demilitarised for decades under a Soviet-era pact. But Finland's entry to NATO and the invasion of Ukraine and the hybrid war campaign that Russia is waging on Europe, which we've discussed in previous podcasts, has ignited a bit of a debate about what should be done with these islands. They're of great strategic importance to the Baltic Sea. They basically unlock access to the Baltic Sea if you control them. And I suppose I went to the islands to find out not just what it's like to live there, but also the extent to which they play into that security debate. And part of the reason I went was that the Swedish head of the Swedish Defence Forces recently said that he believes Putin, quote, has his eyes on not just these Åland Islands where I was, but also Gotland, a Swedish island that was remilitarised in 2014 in response to the annexation of Crimea. So I was over there speaking to the Coast Guard, who've been keeping an eye out for any potential sabotage on key infrastructure in the area, spoke to some MPs, spoke to some anti-war, pro-Ukraine really, demonstrators who gather outside a Russian consulate, which remains on the island as part of that security pact I mentioned earlier. And I got a strong sense from the islanders that even though they're acutely aware of the security risks at the moment, they're aware that the world and the region has become much more dangerous, they want to hold on to that demilitarization. They pointed out that Finland will still come to the defense of the island if Putin were to attack it. And there's a sort of way of life on that island which has been delicately preserved over the years. It's a great fishing spot, fishing huts all over the place. It's got beautiful red granite cliffs. It really has managed to maintain that sort of island lifestyle that's hermetically sealed off from the busy wider world. And so they've got this dilemma really, which is that some of their allies in the region are saying it's time to remilitarize, but I think they'd much prefer not doing that.
It's a fascinating story, James, and I just think it's so great that you get to go to these places and relay what you see there. What was the sort of level of worry that you detected on the islands? You say they're kind of a little bit, not closed off is maybe the wrong words, but they're a little bit isolated. How real was the war and the security threat to them, did you think?
Well, the Finns are not known for panicking and they're not known for exaggeration, and they speak about dangerous, scary stuff in a very sort of understated and calm manner, which is not necessarily the case in some of the other parts of the world threatened by war that I've visited over the years. But I'll give you an example. I went out with the Finnish Coast Guard around the Åland Islands, and I got chatting to them about how the war in Ukraine and the entry to NATO has kind of changed their daily routine. And Lieutenant Yuri Yalava, who's part of the Coast Guard, told me that everything has become more intense, he said. We're taking great care of watching what happens out on the seas, not exactly in our area of operations, he means the coastal areas around the island, but further to get indications of what might be approaching our waters. And he was talking about two things. One, a shadow fleet of rusty Russian tankers that kind of skirt NATO's waters as they're breaking sanctions to bring supplies like oil to Russia. And there's a concern there that because those ships are in such a poor state of repair, they might cause some kind of environmental catastrophe, deliberately or otherwise, in the region, which would, of course, have a direct effect on the Åland Islands because they're so close by. But they're also having to be more aware of the risk of sabotage to critical infrastructure like wind turbines or power cables which run under the sea. Now, lots of parts of Europe have got increased maritime surveillance because of this hybrid war campaign that Russia's waging. But the Åland Islands are in this unique position where they're completely, as I said, demilitarized. You can't have military bases on the island. You can't put up air defense batteries and that sort of thing. So they've had to be quite creative in terms of how they respond to these threats. And one of the things that's changed in that sense is that the Coast Guard is it's almost the first or the earliest line of defense in terms of keeping an eye out for spies. And if this sounds like Cold War era paranoia, there was a pretty serious incident in October 2023 in that region, the Baltic Connector, which is a long gas pipeline that connects NATO members in the Baltic Sea. That was sabotaged, as I said, in October 2023, and the suspicion among Finnish officials and other NATO officials is that that was Russia. So they're looking out basically for a repeat of that security incident, and that's why they're being so vigilant.
And just finally, James, what happens every day outside the Russian consulate on the Åland Islands that you saw?
Yeah, this is the other kind of flavour that I got of the way that the outside world is felt very keenly on the Åland Islands, even though it's quite remote and cut off from everywhere else. Every day at 5 p.m, a group of mainly elderly islanders will gather outside the Russian consulate, and they've got Putin go home placards and stop the war placards and that sort of thing. It's a pro-Ukrainian demonstration. They sing the EU national anthem and they gather right outside the consulate, and it's their way of making their voice heard and saying, Putin, stop invading Ukraine. And as I said, they've been doing it every day for more than 900 days now since the invasion. So they're really dedicated. And sometimes actually pleasure boats will come and ferries will come and drop off Finnish tourists and foreign tourists who want to look around the island. And these chaps will actually kind of grab the tourists and bring them to the protests so they can take part. And so that also, I think, speaks to an island which is not actually that insular. I mean, even the older retired residents of the island are engaged politically, geopolitically, if you like, in what's happening elsewhere. They know this is an island that potentially might be affected by increased Russian expansionism in the near future. And so I thought that was also quite an interesting part of the story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, James, for bringing us that. And before everybody writes in, of course, the Åland Islands are in the Gulf of Bothnia, not the Gulf of Finland. I do apologise. But if you're listening to this podcast from the Åland Islands, or if indeed you've taken part in this protest or know people who have, please do feel free to get in touch with the show. Our email address is in the show notes. We'd very much like to hear from you. Thank you, James, so much for that. It's been great having you back on the podcast, and best of luck. I know you have to run off and do some other foreign reporting now. So thank you, James. Roland, it's wonderful to have you back from your holidays. Could you start just by telling us a little bit about Alexei Dyumin, the man Putin has chosen to in their words, drive Ukraine off Russian land?
Yeah, it's good to be back. So Alexei Dyumin, an interesting character, and regular listeners may remember that several months ago I was on talking about him before because he was suddenly promoted to an obscure but important sounding position in Moscow back in May, which raised eyebrows and had people talking about what has Putin got in mind for this guy? Is he even potentially a future successor of Vladimir Putin? And this decision, giving him the job, incredibly important job basically of kicking Ukrainians out of Kursk, if they can, is only going to cement that impression that he has been earmarked for great things by the boss. Without further ado, who is Alexei Dyumin? Alexei Dyumin, his official title at the moment is Secretary of the State Council. But his real background is he's one of Vladimir Putin's former bodyguards, and he's one of a number of Putin's bodyguards who the president has promoted to greater things throughout the years. Dyumin tends to distinguish himself as, of that bunch, he's thought of as the sharpest pencil in the box. He's the one who's shown the most aptitude and actually getting to grips with civil administration or just acting like a competent civil servant. He was born in 1972. He was incidentally born in Kursk, but he didn't stay around there. He's from a military family. He moved around with his dad's job. And then in 1995, so in his 20s, he joined the Federal Guard Service, loosely analogous to the US Secret Service, the Russian agency charged with keeping the president and other high officials safe. In that capacity, he found himself working with Vladimir Putin, and he catches Putin's eye. One of the stories is that Vladimir Putin is sleeping in one of his official residences and a bear comes up and starts banging on the window, and Alexei Dyumin runs out and fires his pistol in the air and scares the bear off. Vladimir Putin learns about it and is very pleased with this guy. And eventually he becomes one of the guys who is doing more than just bodyguarding, really. In his own account in comments to Russian state media, he's described how he was, one of the people bringing the president his morning brief when he gets up in the morning. Might be the guy who's told to go and ring the governor of so-and-so or the head of whatever agency and give him this instruction the president wants you to do X, Y, or Z. By 2014, he's risen so far. He's deputy head of the GRU, Russian military intelligence. He's believed to have played a key role in the annexation of Crimea. He's thought to be the man who organised the Russian operation to extract President Yanukovych, former president of the fugitive president of Ukraine, from Crimea just after the Maidan Revolution. He briefly serves as Deputy Defence Minister in that era. Remember, this is the era of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. And then in 2016, he's suddenly sent to be the regional governor of the province of Tula, a few hours' drive south of Moscow. Pleasant enough place, quite strategically important. It's got a big arms industry there. And he was there until this May. And the interesting thing about Dyumin is that he did quite well in Tula, by all accounts. He's quite popular there amongst locals. He certainly saw the city kind of pick up a bit. He's noted to have done good things for the buses. He made the buses run on time, this kind of thing. So he was, within the past 5 years, you started to see his name come up when Kremlinologists begin to talk about, or perennially talk about, okay, who would succeed Vladimir Putin if he dies? Who's in the running? And various names come up. The shortlist sometimes changes. It's all a lot of guesswork because Vladimir Putin never actually anoints anybody. But Alexei Dyumin's name started coming up. I started hearing about it a few years ago as one to watch. And then in May this year, he suddenly recalled from Tula and made Secretary of the State Council, which was a very interesting move because the State Council isn't really anything. It's this kind of very nebulous body, which includes a huge number of people. I think it includes most of the governors of the Russian regions, but it also includes ministries, heads of other agencies, all kinds of people who the president should be consulting with anyway. It's got no decision-making power at all. The previous guy in the job didn't really do much with it. So the question was why? And the analysis really was, well, it's kind of what you make of it. But it also might be, look, this guy's got experience in the security services. He's got experience in the regions. Why not bring him back to Moscow and give him experience at the kind of federal level, close to the Kremlin? And maybe he'll be being groomed for greater things. Could he be Vladimir Putin's chosen successor? Who knows? Is he short a pick for defense minister, maybe prime minister? We don't know. But this decision today is absolutely taken as setting in stone, confirming everyone's suspicions that Vladimir Putin really considers this guy now one of his absolutely key lieutenants. If you think about what he's been charged with, the authority he has been given, basically to coordinate all kinds of agencies, army, FSB, border guards, whoever else, in doing whatever it takes to push the Ukrainians back in Kursk region. That's a phenomenal amount of trust. It gives him a phenomenal amount of power. It gives him more power probably than the defense minister himself, because he will be overseeing things. And as Rybar, the Russian kind of Russian propaganda channel, noted, everybody is going to be wanting to get a meeting with this guy and get a meeting pretty quickly, because presumably one of his jobs is going to be to present a report to Mr. Putin about what exactly went wrong here. Which of the generals or the governors or the other officials dealing with things in Kursk region along the border got it wrong and should be punished, and which ones are the ones who should be promoted, and so on. So he has emerged as a man of significant power in the Putin Kremlin post the reshuffle in May.
Roland, 2 questions on him then. Why, to fight a war, why has Putin not chosen a general? As somebody in the armed forces? And secondly, do you think the Ukrainians will be particularly scared of Dyumin?
Why not a general? I mean, I think it signifies he's never really had a great relationship with the military, to be absolutely honest. He's not a military man. It signifies a sense of dissatisfaction, anger with the performance of the military, the performance of the generals, the performance of the defense ministry in general, which we saw with, Sergei Shoigu being shuffled aside in the same kind of May reshuffle that brought Dyumin into Moscow. I think that's part of the answer here. Okay, I'm reaching for a crusty World War II analogy, but go back to World War II. Think of Stalin sending Khrushchev to oversee the defense of Stalingrad. It's the generals who are running the army, obviously, but a very high-level kind of Politburo member answering back to the boss, overseeing everything else. The generally kind of accepted analysis of the reshuffle in May when Sergei Shoigu was fired as defense minister was that Vladimir Putin had finally decided, okay, it's time for some kind of outside control of the army, the security services, everyone else. There's a recognition that they had not been performing, the war had not gone to plan, and someone else had to come in and knock some kind of heads together, someone who was personally loyal to Vladimir Putin. I think that's the brief answer. Part of the job is probably going to be to basically frighten a lot of these generals, possibly write a report fingering who should be punished and who should be rewarded. If I was any of those senior military officials who'd been responsible for that part of the border, I'd be pretty worried. Secondly, should the Ukrainians be scared of him? Look, he's not a general. He hasn't got any proven experience in running conventional land operations. We know he was involved in the annexation of Crimea, but the annexation of Crimea was a covert operation. This is quite a different thing. This is not someone of the pedigree of, say, General Surovikin, who was known to be a very competent Russian general who did cause the Ukrainians significant problems before he was kind of demoted and disappeared after Prigozhin's coup attempt last year.
Roland, can you tell us a little bit about the countryside that we're talking about? You mentioned earlier that you'd spent some time reporting in Kursk. What would you want people listening to know about the region?
I mean, yeah, I remember I actually travelled straight through that a long time ago now, 10 years ago now, actually. I remember going down to Rylsk, which is one of the towns that we think the Ukrainians might be headed towards. They're not there yet, but could ultimately be one of the targets of this offensive. I remember driving all the way through Kursk region to Kursk and down to Belgorod. I think I was actually meant to be looking for the Russian invasion force just before they crossed the border the first time in 2014. I mean, it's as you'd expect, not, obviously not dissimilar to those parts of Ukraine. It's largely agricultural. It's largely very open. I don't think it'd be fair to call it absolutely snooker table flat. It's more of this kind of rolling landscape. Fields that go up and down on very, very long, broad, slowly undulating contours. And in between steppe and the agricultural land, you'll have the tree lines that are so familiar to us from the Ukrainian battlefields, because that was a kind of Soviet Union-wide kind of project, the tree planting operation. And you'll also have in the valleys, in between all those ridges, you'll have the towns, the villages, the rivers and the marshes also significantly. So although the ground will be dry at the moment, so very manoeuvrable for tracked vehicles and other vehicles, the main roads at least, pretty good. I didn't get too far off it. But those other lowland areas, the marshes, the rivers, where the little towns are, they will, I suspect, kind of hinder the ability of either side for entirely free manoeuvre. But yeah, largely a big agricultural area, relatively prosperous agriculturally, I would say. A lot of very big farms, very big ploughed fields, all that thing centered around those big dusty towns like Kursk and Belgorod. And a lot of people who speak, if they don't speak Ukrainian, some people do speak Ukrainian. The Russians down there speak with a southern accent, which has a few little kind of Ukrainian Turks. They use an H instead of a G, for example. So you get the sense down there of kind of being near the border.
And finally, Roland, before we go to our final thoughts, I know we don't have Francis. He is returning tomorrow, I think, but he's off for a few days. But I know you wanted to make another World War II analogy, comparison, and talk a little bit about Operation Citadel. What are your thoughts?
Oh, no, I mean, I came back and, I've been away for 2 weeks and I came back having been blissfully ignorant of the news, and I was just wondering how many times it had been mentioned already since this Kursk operation began. Look, at the risk of drawing the ire of editors and listeners who believe that World War II analogies should not be abused, and of course they should not. Obviously, Kursk, 1943, huge, very famous battle, one of the turning points of the Second World War, precisely in this landscape that I was just describing. There's a couple of parallels to make, partly because, the Russian government, or some Russian officials have been making those parallels. There was a Russian, one of the Russian embassies in one country or another, I can't remember, put on a Twitter feed, we defeated the Nazis at Kursk in 1943, and we'll do it again now, and it's just the same, and all these parallels, because of course the Soviets won at Kursk in 1943. But there's a number of significant differences. The first one is that, look, the reason the Soviets won at the Battle of Kursk, as I believe some of the Russian propaganda channels have already pointed out, but I think erroneously, is that they were incredibly well prepared. They knew it was coming. They knew it was coming for months. They dug in for months. They had three lines of defense, huge minefields, vast numbers of reserves. They knew exactly where the German hammer blow was going to fall, and when it came, they were ready for it. So they absorbed the advance, basically exhausted the Germans over many months, and that was that. And the difference this time is absolutely stark, which is that they obviously were not prepared. What's happened here is a really good example of, just looking at Dom, what would you call it? Operational security? Is that a reasonable thing? Radio silence, whatever you want to call it. You know, we've seen reports of Ukrainian battalion commanders only being told 3 days before the operation that it was happening. Some soldiers being told on the day it was going to happen. Nothing leaked. We're still not seeing much coming out from Ukrainian sources. Discipline here is absolutely remarkable. So surprise has been a real key element of the Ukrainian success, and the lack of Russian preparedness, I think, is stark. And so in that sense, if you wanted to draw a parallel with the Battle of Kursk, I think the more instructive one would be last year's offensive in Zaporizhia, where similarly that was kind of trailed for like 6 months. It wasn't much of a secret, the broad area where that was going to fall, and the Russians dug in big time and were able to basically absorb and hold off the Ukrainian offensive. I was speaking to a soldier who fought throughout that offensive. He's not taking part in the Kursk attack, but he was saying that everything about this is different to Zaporizhia. The preparation, the force, the surprise, and the discipline is what caught his eye.
Coming up, we hear Dom and Roland's final thoughts. Let's move then to our final thoughts from Roland and Dom, but Roland, we'll give you a few minutes to catch your breath. Dom, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I've been thinking about how this Kursk operation has galvanised the discussion about Ukraine's use of sophisticated Western weaponry, in particular long-range stuff, Storm Shadow, ATACMS, that kind of thing. The last day or two, there's been a slight expansion of this argument. I know that there's still the argument saying that there's a moral case for sending sophisticated munitions, Storm Shadow, as I say, ATACMS, to Ukraine, and we know the pushback against that's ongoing. But secondly, an issue that's coming to the fore that I think we're going to see a lot more of, and we need to discuss, is that a lot of similar weapons, similarly sophisticated, high precision, long range stuff, are coming back at Ukraine from Russia. A lot of those weapons rely on, or certainly use, Western microelectronics that are subject to a sanctions regime, but still seem to be getting through. And the argument on this second strand goes like this: is why is Russia allowed to use, seemingly with very little restraint, Western sophisticated kit, and Ukraine is not? And I think this debate will come to the fore, and it's basically saying to the West, either tighten up your sanctions regime that isn't working, or remove the restrictions on Ukraine's use of the same equipment. It's not a fair fight at the moment. You can't deny them the use of stuff that you are allowing to get through to Russia, because your sanctions regime is too leaky. And I think that case will become stronger in the next few weeks, rather than certainly alongside the moral case for sending long range and sophisticated stuff to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Dom, for your time and your reporting today. Roland, would you like to finish today's episode with your final thoughts?
Look, I'm fascinated by what's happening in Kursk. This secrecy we're talking about is also the nature of the true Ukrainian objective and the true intention, the true battle plan here. I mean, Dom made a pretty good stab at fleshing out what could be an option, but the Ukrainians are being very careful not to actually let on whatsoever what they're actually trying to achieve here. I mean, we broadly know that, okay, they want to draw Russian reserves away from the Donbass. They want to possibly improve their negotiating position in any future talks, embarrass Vladimir Putin, all of that. But what is the actual kind of specific game plan on the ground? We just don't know, and we're probably not going to know until they've achieved it or after all this is over. But that said, I messaged another Ukrainian soldier friend today, chap in the Ukrainian army, asked him, are you quote unquote on vacation, which is, the term the Russians used to use for their supposedly deniable troops in Ukraine years ago. He said, no, I'm on a more pessimistic part of the front, but I think we will hold. So just a note to remind people that the battles continue down in Donbass and elsewhere, that the Russians are still making gains down there, and despite the huge focus on Kursk, it remains a very intense, not easy time for the Ukrainians, so keep your eyes on that part of the front as well.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.